Picture this. It's a warm summer night in 1963. You're standing right in the heart of the British countryside. The air is thick with this heavy, volumetric fog. The whole landscape is bathed in pale moonlight. And in the distance, you hear the heavy, rhythmic chugging of a vintage diesel locomotive piercing the silence. It feels like a scene straight out of a beautifully shot, high-contrast Hollywood documentary, right? Well, welcome to our explainer on the legendary Great Train Robbery. Today we're going to dissect the actual mechanics of a heist that literally captivated a nation, and we'll peel back those layers of cinematic film grain to look at the gritty and honestly pretty tragic reality underneath. So let's dive right in.
Just imagine being a police officer back in '63, sitting in the station and your VHF radio crackles to life with this broadcast. They've just stolen a train. I mean, wow. We're not talking about a corner bank or an armored car here. This was a massive Royal Mail traveling post office. Hearing that instantly set the stakes. The sheer scale and audacity of the crime were just totally unprecedented, which begs the question, who in the world would even attempt something like this? All right, let's look at part one, the audacious master plan.
So a heist like this doesn't just happen on a whim. It was the result of months and months of incredibly meticulous planning by a highly organized 15-man crew, led by a career criminal named Bruce Reynolds. These guys were ambitious. They were totally sick of smaller paydays and hungry for that one piece of work that would set them up for life. But to pull off something of this magnitude, brute force just wasn't going to cut it. They needed a secret weapon. Enter the Ulsterman. This was an unidentified postal worker who completely changed the game. He shifted their entire strategy from a messy, chaotic holdup to an operation of absolute photorealistic precision. He gave them the exact route to target, the overnight Glasgow to London train, and told them exactly which carriages held the high-value packages. But here's the kicker. He tipped them off that the train would be packed with millions in used, untraceable 1- and 5-pound banknotes that were headed for the shredder because they didn't have sequential serial numbers. That cash was a thief's absolute dream. Moving right along to Section 2, ambush in the countryside.
So, armed with all that inside knowledge, the crew sets their trap. We're talking an isolated, pitch-black stretch of track out in Buckinghamshire, right in the early hours of August 8th. Let's walk through this because the timeline is just lightning fast. At 3 a.m., out there in the moonlight, this massive locomotive is forced to halt at Sears Crossing. And how did they stop a train without blowing up the tracks? Pure ingenuity. They literally just covered the green track signal with an old leather glove and used a basic 6-volt battery to light up the red signal. Incredible, right? When the train stopped, they swarmed the cab. By 3:15 a.m., working under the stark, dramatic lighting of their flashlights, they uncoupled the high-value coach from the rest of the 72-carriage train and forced the driver to move it half a mile down to Bridego Bridge. And then, by 3:30 a.m., working in a human chain with total military precision, they unloaded 120 mailbags into waiting Land Rovers. Boom. In just 30 minutes, the gang completely vanished into the night.
But hey, we really need to pause here for a second, because this wasn't some victimless, gentlemanly caper like the press later painted it out to be. Not at all. When that train was stopped, the driver, Jack Mills, was brutally struck over the head with a metal bar. He suffered severe, permanent brain injuries. And that stark, awful fact totally pierces the romantic illusion of the heist. Real blood was spilled. An innocent, working-class guy who was just out there doing his job had his life permanently destroyed in the name of greed. Okay, let's get into Section 3, the hideout and haul. So, leaving a bleeding driver and a completely stunned crew behind, the gang slips away into that heavy volumetric fog. They retreat about 27 miles to a rented property known as Leather Slade Farm. This was their safe house, right? A place to monitor the police radios and finally take stock of what they actually managed to pull off. And the number is just staggering. 2.6 million pounds. To put that into perspective, in today's money, that's equivalent to over 40 million pounds. It was so much cash, mostly in those small used notes, that it literally weighed 2.5 tons. Think about that for a second. The sheer magnitude of this prize left even these hardened veteran criminals totally awestruck. The story goes that when they hit the 1 million pound mark during the count, the entire room just stopped and stared in absolute disbelief. It's almost surreal, isn't it? Just picture this highly detailed cinematic scene. You've got 15 men deep in the English countryside hiding from the largest police manhunt in British history, and they're dividing up literal mountains of cash. They've got pop music blasting on the radio. One of the guys was apparently dancing around singing Jerry and the Pacemakers. And, you honestly can't make this up, they sat down to play a game of Monopoly, but instead of the fake, colorful paper money, they were using the real, stolen banknotes.
It was this bizarre moment of absolute, seemingly untouchable victory. Which brings us to Section 4, the Flying Squad Strikes. But, as you might guess, that total victory? Extremely short-lived. Scotland Yard mobilized its elite flying squad, led by this relentless guy, Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler, and the net closed in fast. The gang actually panicked over some police radio broadcasts and fled their hideout early, paying a guy to burn the farm down to destroy all the evidence. But the guy never set the fire. So when police finally found Leatherslade Farm, it was an absolute forensic goldmine. It's kind of fascinating how the smartest criminals can make the absolute dumbest mistakes. I mean, they found a mundane tea strainer, which actually threw the cops for a loop for a second, making them think a woman was involved. But way more importantly, they found incredibly detailed, ultra-sharp fingerprints on a ketchup bottle. And, yep, fingerprints all over that Monopoly board. These totally everyday, mundane items gave Tommy Butler exactly the catastrophic physical evidence he needed.
On to Section 5, Trials and Daring Escapes.
With all that physical evidence directly matching the fingerprints of known criminals, Butler's flying squad just swept through the underworld. By January 1964, the main suspects were already standing trial at the Aylesbury Assizes. And let me tell you, the establishment was absolutely furious. They fully intended to make a severe example out of these men. When the verdicts dropped, the combined sentences for the convicted robbers totaled over 300 years. A lot of the key players were slapped with massive 30-year sentences. The message from the British justice system couldn't have been clearer. The sheer audacity of this crime, and especially the brutal violence used against the train driver, was absolutely not going to be tolerated.
Now, you'd think that's the end of it, right? Locked up and key thrown away. No way. The sheer length of those sentences actually sparked a series of totally daring escapes that massively embarrassed the authorities. The most famous one, for sure, was Ronnie Biggs. This guy literally scaled the wall of Wandsworth Prison with a rope ladder, dropped into a waiting furniture removal van, and eventually fled all the way to Brazil. And he lived out there for decades, openly mocking the British police. Sensational escapes like that, they just poured gasoline on the fire of public fascination. It kept the gang in the daily headlines for years. Finally, Section 6, the myth versus reality. And this is exactly where popular culture stepped in and completely, totally warped the narrative. Over time, the public sort of stopped seeing a violent gang of thieves and instead started viewing them as these cheeky anti-heroes, celebrating how they defied the establishment. But just look at the stark contrast when you actually weigh the myth against the facts. On one hand, society celebrates these brilliant, victimless gentlemen thieves pulling off a flawless, cinematic caper destined for a life of luxury. But the grim reality? They were violent criminals who permanently disabled a railway worker. They were undone by unbelievably basic blunders. Forgetting to wipe down a ketchup bottle. And the aftermath? Mostly, it was decades in maximum security prison, a stressful life constantly on the run, or just deeply tragic deaths. Let's ground this by looking at one guy specifically, Buster Edwards. In the myth, Edwards is immortalized as this lovable, charming rogue. He was even famously played by the musician Phil Collins in a really lighthearted, romanticized 1988 comedy film. But the reality was incredibly bleak. After serving his time, Edwards struggled big time. He ended up running a small flower stall outside London's Waterloo station, and he famously called his straight life dreary compared to his criminal past. He was haunted by depression and alcoholism, and tragically, Edwards died by suicide in a lock-up garage in 1994. The Hollywood glorification just entirely glossed over the emptiness and despair of his actual life. And of course, we absolutely must remember the true victim of August 8, 1963. While the robbers were being immortalized on the silver screen and celebrated in the press, Jack Mills was quietly suffering. He never fully recovered from that massive head trauma. He tried to return to do light duties for a while, but he never overcame the physical and psychological trauma of that night. He retired and passed away just 7 years later in 1970. He and his family ultimately paid the price for the gang's mythical payday. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a lingering thought. Looking back at that heavy fog, the vintage Royal Mail train, and the brutal reality hidden behind the charm of the crime of the century, we really have to ask ourselves, why is society so eager to romanticize violent criminals into enduring folk heroes? Why do we always seem to prefer the myth of the gentleman thief over the gritty truth of the victims they leave behind? It's definitely a question worth pondering the next time you hear a true crime story that sounds just a little too glamorous to be true.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and I'll catch you on the next one.